Well, I'm joined live from San Francisco by the author JD Vance. His best-selling memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, depicts what it's like to grow up white and poor in America, and it's taken the country by storm. JD Vance, drug problems, joblessness, poverty, parents abandoning or unable to look after their children, that's familiar to you, isn't it? That's your story.
Yes, unfortunately, it's very familiar to me. It's what I write about in the book. And if you look at the data, or if you just go and talk to some of the folks who live in Eastern Kentucky or Southern Ohio like you did, you realize that those stories are awfully common, too common, I think.
I mean, that's exactly right. We stopped people randomly in the street, and all of them said they knew somebody who'd been affected by drugs or had been brought up by grandparents. What has gone wrong in these communities?
Well, I think partially you saw it when you visited Eastern Kentucky, is that the economy in this area has been really hard hit. You know, these are areas that depended on coal mines, on steel mills, on a lot of other manufacturing industries that just don't exist anymore, or at least don't exist in quite the volume needed to support a local economy. So what's happened is that as people have lost jobs, as people have lost hope, they've really, I think in some ways, turned over to other habits or other things to try to dull that pain. And that's a big part of where this opioid crisis comes from. It's not just people who like drugs or want to be addicted to drugs. It's that they're really trying to find something to do, something to dull that pain that comes from living in areas that are really struggling.
I mean, you describe it in your book as a cultural crisis. What is it about white, working class, poor communities that is in crisis, would you say? What is it about the lifestyle, if you like, or the culture?
Well, I think that the biggest problem is that folks have really lost hope in these communities. And so one of the things I realized when I was a kid, one of the things my grandma really recognized in me, is that there was a certain cultural message that I was getting from my neighborhood, from my family, from the people around me, that there really wasn't any hope left, that no matter how hard you worked, no matter how hard you tried to get ahead, it wasn't going to result in anything. And I think it's important to recognize that life is unfair in these communities. I'm sure you saw it when you visited. But there's also something important to be said for continuing to believe that you have some control over your life, that you have some agency over your life. And when people have lost that, it really creates a lot of self-destructive tendencies.
Of course, elections are often seen as a time of hope, you know, potential for change. Can you explain why some of the poorest people in America would look at the billionaire Donald Trump and think, yes, he speaks for me?
Yeah, well, you know, of course, it's not just the poorest Americans. It's lower and middle income Americans who are also supporting Donald Trump. And what really his support comes from, I think, is that folks have thought for the past 30 or 40 years that politicians on both parties, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, have made a lot of promises, have said that things are going to get a lot better, but really these communities have continued to go in a negative direction. Things haven't gotten a whole lot better. And so Donald Trump is the first politician from either party in a long time to come along and say, we need to go in a radically different direction. We need to renegotiate trade deals. We need to radically rethink our approach to immigration. You may not agree with him, but in an area that's felt so ignored for so long, the fact that he's even talking about a new direction has a lot of appeal.
But it's interesting, isn't it, that very poor black communities or Hispanic communities tend to vote Democrat. What is it about white communities that make them attracted to Donald Trump?
Well, a lot of it just goes back to the history of American politics. And, you know, 40 or so years ago, the Republicans really made a strategic choice that they were going to go after primarily white voters. And if they were going to go after minority voters at all, it was going to be more upscale minority voters. So you've definitely seen over the past 40 years that that's had consequences, and minority groups in the United States have consistently gravitated towards the Democrats. What the Republicans represent, I think, separate for poor white Americans, is really a cultural home for a lot of people who feel very frustrated by what we in America call the coastal elite, so the people living in California or in New York. The Republicans have really made a point of making a party out of the middle part of the country, and they've had success.
JD Vance, have to end it there. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.